The council laughed at the Deathworld girl's dented badge. They stopped laughing in 47 seconds. The windows went black at the exact second the room stopped laughing. 62 shadows slid across the observation glass of Concordat Hub Prime, swallowing the gas giant's orange glow in a single breath. Provost High Marshal Kalen Vaughn's mandibles were still parted around the end of a joke he never finished. 47 seconds. That had been her exact warning, delivered without raising her voice once, and he had laughed through every second of it. Now the laughing had a different shape. 6 eye stalks twisted toward the glass in short, jerking pulls, and a thin ribbon of emerald musk beaded along his collar plate. It smelled sharp, like burnt copper left too long on a stove. On the deck near his boot sat a small brass badge, dented along one edge, knocked loose from a child's coat only minutes before. He hadn't looked at it since. Elizabeth Vance had. She knelt beside her daughter, one hand pressed flat against the girl's scraped cheek, her eyes locked on the High Marshal's collar and nowhere else. She didn't need to raise her voice either. The tactical display behind the checkmate counter, the one Vaughn had waved off as a civilian decoration 20 minutes earlier, flipped from blue to solid red. Line after line of target locks bloomed across the station's cooling core like a rash spreading under skin. No warning shot, no demand, no second chance. Somewhere between the third lock and the ninth, Vaughn's guards had set their prods down on the deck. Nobody had ordered them to. Their hands had simply decided faster than their minds could argue with the decision. "You said the math doesn't care about rank." Elizabeth's voice stayed quiet, almost gentle. "I told you that twice." Outside the glass, the lead dreadnought's forward array began to hum, a low note that traveled up through the deck plating and into the soles of every boot in the room. Vaughn opened his mandibles to answer her. "Nothing came out. You should know this isn't a bluff." The mother had already finished counting. The badge had been worn once too, pressed into Alina's small palm that morning, long before the windows on this station ever thought about turning dark. It had belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother, brass gone soft and scratched from 3 generations of thumbs. Alina had rubbed it once for luck and pinned it crooked over her coat pocket, and Elizabeth had straightened it without a word, the way she'd done every morning since Alina turned 6. "It makes me feel brave," Alina had said, "not for the first time, like you." By the time they reached Concordat Hub Prime, the badge had already done its job. Alina walked into the checkpoint with her chin up, one hand resting flat over the small dent in the metal like she was keeping something alive underneath it. The processing bay swallowed them whole. It was a vast chrome cavern that smelled of recycled air and the mineral bite of iron-filtered light, packed wall-to-wall with sulfur breathers, chitin-backed functionaries, and a low electronic murmur that never quite stopped. Clark Zix worked the nearest counter, a twitchy four-nosed biped who counted his stamps out loud under his breath, losing track every few seconds and starting over. 1, 2, 3, wait, 1, 2. Alina watched him for a long moment, tilting her head. Why does he have 4 noses? Elizabeth's jaw, normally set like a hinge that had rusted shut, softened just slightly at one corner. "Ask him, politely." "Sir, why do you have 4 noses?" Zix froze mid-count, all 4 nostrils flaring at once in what might have been alarm or might have simply been his version of surprise. "Redundancy," he managed, "in case one gets clogged." Alina considered this with great seriousness, then nodded, satisfied, as if she'd suspected as much all along. Guard Wren stood a few feet off, armor scuffed pale at the joints, a low-voltage prod hanging loose from one gauntlet like he'd forgotten he was holding it. He didn't laugh at the exchange. He watched the badge on Alina's coat a beat too long, then looked away first. The terminal in front of Zix blinked once, processing Alina's transit registration, and a single line scrolled across the lower display before he could swipe it clear. No active military vessels registered to this civilian terminal, current sector. Zix didn't seem to notice it. Elizabeth did. She filed it away the way she filed everything, without changing her face at all. That was when the crowd near the lane behind them went quiet, the kind of quiet that moves through a room before anyone says why. Provost High Marshal Kalen Vaughan arrived the way weather arrives, all at once and too large for the doorway he came through. 9 feet of armored thorax, a gold-braided sash crossing his shield plate, crystalline mandibles clattering together like gravel poured down a chute with every step. He stopped directly in front of Alina's lane and did not look at Elizabeth at all. He looked at the badge. That, Vaughan said, one foreleg extending toward Alina's coat pocket, is not a registered article. Elizabeth shifted half a step, angling her body in front of Alina without seeming to move at all. It's an heirloom, she said. Inert metal, no charge, no frequency, nothing your scanners would ever flag. Sentiment, Vaughan said, testing the word in his mouth like he expected it to break. Sentiment does not clear customs. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby lanes, soft at first, the kind that grows once it realizes no one is going to stop it. Transit Deputy Vane, a reedy official with a clipboard she never once looked up from, kept her eyes fixed on her own screen and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. She's 8, Elizabeth said, just that. No raised voice, no plea in it. Vaughan's mandibles clattered once, sharp, almost a laugh of his own. Then she is old enough to learn that primitive scrap does not buy passage through a concordat checkmate. He extended one chitinous foreleg, not toward Elizabeth, but past her, toward the small brass shape pinned crooked over Alina's heart. Alina's hand came up to cover it on instinct, the same motion she'd used 100 mornings in a row, and for half a second it looked like it might be enough. It wasn't. Vaughan's foreleg flicked, fast and almost casual, the kind of gesture a being makes when swatting something it has already decided does not matter. The badge tore free from the coat with a small metallic snap. Alina, still reaching for it, lost her footing on the polished deck and went down hard against the base of a structural support pillar. The badge skittered across the chrome floor and came to rest, dented along one new edge, 3 feet from where it started. For a moment nobody in the bay made a sound. Then somewhere behind the checkmate counter, a guard laughed, short and surprised, the kind of laugh that escapes before a person decides whether it's appropriate. Alina didn't cry. She sat very still against the pillar, one hand pressed to a fresh scrape along her cheek, looking at the badge on the floor like she was deciding whether it was still hers. Elizabeth Vance did not move. Not yet. She crossed the distance to Alina in 3 unhurried steps and knelt on the cold deck, ignoring the High Marshal entirely. Her thumb came up and wiped the scrape clean, gentle, the same motion she used on scraped knees and nothing else, ever. You're okay, she said, quiet enough that only Alina could hear it. I've got you. Then she picked up the badge. She turned it once in her palm, feeling the new dent under her thumb, and for 1 second her eyes lost their focus on the room entirely, the way a person's eyes go when they are doing very fast math somewhere behind them. Vaughan mistook the silence for something it wasn't. You may collect your scrap and proceed to secondary processing, he said, already half turned away, mandibles clattering with the satisfaction of a being who believes a matter is closed. He laughed once more, low and dismissive, certain the small human family in front of him had nothing left to say. He mistook a mother's silence for compliance. That was his penultimate mistake. Elizabeth rose to her full height, settled Alina gently behind her, and pressed 2 fingers to the wristcom under her sleeve. It wasn't standard civilian hardware. It had never been registered to this terminal, in this sector, or in any sector a clerk like Zix had clearance to search. It gave a small, soft click. Nobody in the bay heard it. Not yet. 47 seconds, Elizabeth said. The number filled the space where Vaughan's dismissal had been, plain and unhurried. That's how long you have to release your guard's weapons and step back from this lane. Vaughan's mandibles clattered, delighted now instead of bored. You will count down on Concordat soil inside a hub under my jurisdiction and expect that to mean something. I already sent it. She didn't raise her voice. The counting was just for you. Behind the counter, Clark Zix's screen flickered through a string of symbols too fast to read, then settled on a single line that made all four of his nostrils flare at once. He looked up, forgetting to count anything at all. "Sir," he aimed it at Vaughn, not at Elizabeth. "There's a resonance signature on the perimeter grid. It wasn't there 90 seconds ago." "Civilian static." Vaughn didn't bother looking at him. "This terminal sees ghosts in its sensors twice a cycle. Mind your stamps." Zix opened his mouth to argue, and then didn't, the way people stop arguing with someone who outranks the facts. Vaughn turned the full weight of his attention back to Elizabeth, mandibles spread in something almost like a smile, if a smile could be built from gravel. "Let me explain how jurisdiction works for the species that hasn't earned a seat on the Concordat Council. Local authority is absolute inside this ring. Border worlds, civilian terminals, half-grown colonies with delusions of fleet command." He let the eye stalks drift toward Elena, dismissive. "Nothing outside this station's hull has any claim here. Not your government, not your military, certainly not a woman traveling under a civilian manifest. We did not spend 3 centuries taming a volatile gravity well," Elizabeth said, "to let a clerk write rules for our bloodline." She spoke once, she did not repeat it, she began to count. Vaughn laughed at that too, louder than before, the kind of laugh meant to be heard by everyone still pretending not to watch. A few of the functionaries near the lane laughed along with him, more out of habit than conviction, the way a crowd echoes whoever sounds most certain. Elena tugged once on the hem of Elizabeth's coat. "Are we in trouble?" Elizabeth crouched just enough to put her face level with her daughter's, ignoring the 9 feet of armored marshal still talking above them. "No," she said, "he is." It was the only soft thing she said in the entire processing bay, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to. A new voice cut through the speakers bolted along the bay's ceiling, flat and official, the kind of voice that announced shuttle delays and gravity maintenance, and nothing more interesting than that, usually. "All checkpoint personnel, this is Station Director Imrakos. We are reading an unscheduled resonance bloom along the outer defense ring. Confirm source." Nobody confirmed anything. The bloom kept growing. Vaughn's eye stalks twitched toward the ceiling speaker, then back down at Elizabeth, irritation flickering across his collar plate like static. "Coincidence," he said, though nobody had asked. "Your fleet does not have clearance to approach this sector. It does not exist in this sector." "It doesn't need clearance," Elizabeth said. "It needs the time I already gave it." The deck shivered once, faint enough that half the bay mistook it for a passing transit pod. Elizabeth didn't mistake it for anything. Neither did Guard Wren, whose hand had drifted back toward the prod he'd set down earlier without quite picking it up again. Then the alarms began. They didn't build slowly. One moment the bay held its ordinary electronic murmur, and the next, every speaker in the chamber screamed the same toot and klaxon at once, a sound built to be heard through bone. Functionaries scattered from the open lanes. A stack of Zix's carefully counted stamp chips hit the floor and scattered across the chrome, and for once nobody bothered to count them back. "Confirm source," Director Koss repeated over the chaos, his flat announcer's calm finally starting to crack at the edges. "Repeat, confirm source of resonance bloom." On the tactical display behind the counter, the one Vaughn had dismissed as a decoration twice now, a technician 3 lanes down stared at her own readout and went very still. "The locks," her voice barely carried over the klaxons, but it carried far enough. "Sir, the targeting locks on the cooling matrices, they're not new. The timestamp says they've been live for almost 6 minutes. Vaughn's mandibles stopped clattering entirely. 6 minutes, long before Elizabeth had ever opened her mouth to count anything out loud. She had never been counting down to a decision. She had been counting down to an arrival. "Confirm source," Koss said again, and this time his voice cracked clean through the middle of the word. Nobody confirmed anything because nobody could. A junior technician 3 consoles down ran the same query twice, then a third time, fingers moving faster than her own breathing. "Negative match," she finally said, to no one in particular. "Cross-referencing fleet command registries, all human colonial assets. 0 historical records of a mother holding command rank over a Line 1 siege fleet. The system doesn't have a category for this. Then the system is malfunctioning, Vaughn said, but the certainty in his voice had thinned to something closer to habit than belief. The emerald musk Elizabeth would later watch bead along his collar had already started, faint as dew, gathering at the base of his lowest eye stalk. Guard Wren set his prod down on the deck, not dropped. Set down, deliberately, the way a person puts down a tool they've decided they no longer want in their hand. He took 2 steps back from his post and didn't look at Vaughn to see if it was noticed. It was noticed. Vaughn didn't say anything about it. Elizabeth crouched again, unhurried, and pressed the dented badge back into Alina's palm, folding her daughter's small fingers shut around it. "Hold on to this for me," she said, just like always. "Is it going to be okay?" Alina asked. "It already is," Elizabeth said. "You just haven't seen the part where it's okay yet." She did not look back at Vaughn while she said it. She didn't need to. The countdown was doing that work for her now, second by second, somewhere out past the hull where no Clark's stamp had ever had jurisdiction. The gas giant's light, the wide orange band that filled half the observation glass on a normal day, flickered once at its lower edge. Not dimmed, not damaged, folded for less than a heartbeat, the way a sheet of fabric folds when something unseen passes behind it. Nobody in the bay had the vocabulary to say what they'd just watched happen. Koss did a half-second later, his voice gone thin and very far from official. "All decks, brace." Brace turned out to be more of a suggestion than a plan. The deck didn't shake so much as disagree with itself, a low groan traveling up through the support pillars that made the chrome floor feel, for one disorienting second, like something standing on the back of a creature that had just exhaled. Functionaries who had laughed 20 minutes earlier were no longer laughing. They were pressed flat against the nearest wall, or crouched behind luggage carts, or simply standing very still in the open, the way prey animals freeze when the shape of the danger hasn't resolved, yet but the danger itself already has. Vaughn's eye stalks swept the room once, twice, searching for a chain of command that still answered to him. He found Director Koss's voice instead, thin and crackling through the overhead speakers. "This is Concordat Hub Prime to unidentified vessels. You are entering restricted defense space without registered clearance. State your designation or..." The transmission cut, not interference. A choice, made somewhere out past the hull, to stop listening to a sentence it had already decided not to finish hearing. "They're not answering hails," the junior technician said, and now there was no certainty left in her voice at all, only the flat, exhausted clarity of someone watching a number get worse in real time. "Sir, the resonance bloom isn't a single source anymore. It's..." She stopped, recalculated, started again. "It's multiplying." Transit Deputy Vane finally looked up from her clipboard. She set it down on the counter, screen still glowing, and walked away from her station without a word to anyone, joining the small, growing cluster of staff who had already decided which side of this they intended to be standing on when it ended. Vaughn turned back to Elizabeth. For the first time since he'd flicked the badge from Alina's coat, he looked at her properly, the dismissal gone from his eye stalks and something else moving in behind it, something that hadn't had a name in his vocabulary until very recently. "What," he said, "did you call here?" Elizabeth didn't answer him directly. She reached down instead, smoothed a loose strand of hair back from Alina's forehead, and kept her eyes on the glass, where the gas giant's orange light had begun, very faintly, to bend around something that wasn't there yet. "You'll see it in a moment," she said. "You'll only see it once." She was right. The fold that had been bending light at the edge of the gas giant stopped bending it. It tore, a long silent seam unzipping across the orange band of light, and through that seam came the first hull, black and angular and large enough that its shadow alone swallowed half the observation glass before the ship had fully arrived. Then came the second, then 12 more behind it, then the rest, until the gas giant's familiar glow was gone entirely, replaced by a wall of matte hulls arranged in a ring so precise it looked less like a fleet and more like a sentence being finished. The processing bay went silent in a way alarms couldn't manage. Even the klaxons seemed to know they'd lost the room's attention. 62, the junior technician whispered, reading a number off her display like it might change if she said it quietly enough. It didn't change. Forward weapon arrays bloomed white along every hull at once, not firing, just waking, the way a held breath looks different from one being drawn. Lines of targeting light swept across the station's exterior plating and settled, one by one, on the cooling matrices buried deep in Hub Prime's core. The dreadnought arrays did not negotiate with border protocols. They had never been built to. Director Koss's voice came back online, smaller now than it had been a few minutes ago. Primary tactical grid is offline. We have no defensive response capability. I repeat, we have no. You have a choice, Elizabeth said, and somehow her voice still carried over the klaxons without rising at all. Surrender the High Marshal responsible for assaulting a colonial dependent, or don't. Either way, the grid stays down until I decide it doesn't. Vaughn's eye stalks had stopped tracking the room. All 6 of them had locked onto the targeting display, watching crimson lines multiply across a station he had, 20 minutes ago, called the safest jurisdiction in the sector. The emerald musk along his collar had thickened into a steady bead, dripping once onto his gold sash and leaving a small dark stain there. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't seem to notice it was there at all. This is an act of war, Vaughn said, but the clatter had gone out of his mandibles. The words came out close together, almost stacked on top of each other, the sound of someone reciting a script that had stopped fitting the room it was written for. No, Elizabeth picked an invisible thread off Alina's collar, smoothed it flat, and only then looked back up at him. An act of war would have ended already. This is a checkpoint. A young officer near the rear console set his datapad face down on the counter and stepped out from behind it. Then another. Within a few seconds, 3 of Vaughn's own staff had drifted to the far side of the bay, close enough to obey an order if one ever made sense again, far enough that nobody could mistake which command platform they were still standing near. There will be no jurisdiction left to argue. There will be no immunity left to claim. There will be no second warning. Vaughn turned, slow, searching the faces of his own people for one that still answered to him, and found none. It was Koss who finally moved, not toward Vaughn, but toward the badge still cradled in Alina's small fist. He studied it for half a second too long, the way a man studies a uniform pin he half remembers from a history module he never finished, and something behind his eyes shifted. He looked at Elizabeth's hand instead, settled on her daughter's shoulder, and noticed for the first time what was missing from it. The smallest finger, gone clean at the last knuckle, an old scar gone pale and unremarkable with age, the kind of wound that only comes from a service nobody survives by accident. Vance, Koss said, mostly to himself, like the name had just finished arriving from somewhere very far away. Elizabeth didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. An empire that hides behind paperwork cannot withstand an enemy that writes its verdicts in weapon fire. Vaughn's mandibles worked once, twice, trying to assemble a sentence large enough to undo the last 90 seconds. Nothing came. The musk had spread down to his thoracic shield now, thick enough that the nearest functionaries had backed a full step further away, covering their breathing slits out of pure animal instinct. Outside the glass, the dreadnought formation held perfectly still, every muzzle trained and patient, the patience of something that had already finished deciding what it would do and was only waiting for a reason not to. Then the bay's secondary comm panel, the one used for system-wide traffic instead of local checkpoint chatter, lit up with a cascade of automated departure signals. 3 Concordat patrol cutters stationed at the far end of the ring had broken formation without a single order issued, engines flaring, already burning hard for the exit lanes. Nobody had told them to run. They had simply recognized the math faster than anyone else in the room. Elina, who had been quiet through all of it, finally spoke again, tugging the hem of her mother's coat. "Mama, is the bad guy going to cry?" A few of the staff, still close enough to hear it, didn't laugh, but something in their shoulders loosened anyway, the smallest possible release in a room that hadn't had one in several minutes. Maybe, Elizabeth said, some of them do, eventually. She knelt once more, unhurried, and tightened the top button of Elena's coat against a draft that wasn't really there yet but would be soon, once the station's environmental systems started rerouting power away from comfort and toward survival. It was a small, useless, ordinary thing to do in a room full of crimson targeting locks, and she did it anyway, the way she'd done it on 100 mornings that had nothing to do with any of this. Director Koss watched her do it. He had a daughter of his own, 3 decks down in civilian housing, and he found himself thinking of her now with an intensity that had nothing to do with protocol. That was when the comm panel changed again. It wasn't the local checkpoint frequency this time. It was the wide system relay, the one used for sector-spanning traffic between stations that almost never spoke to each other directly, and it was lit up entirely, every channel talking over every other channel at once. Koss leaned toward it without meaning to, and what he heard made him forget for a moment that he was supposed to be in charge of anything. 3 other border hubs along the same trade corridor were reporting unscheduled fleet activity in their own systems. Not arrivals, withdrawals, local garrisons pulling back from their posts, citing classified directives nobody could produce on request, the kind of order that exists in a chain of command too old and too frightened to question out loud. This wasn't a single checkpoint learning a lesson. It was a wider machine, somewhere far above Vaughn's rank, that had already decided exactly how this story was supposed to end, and had started moving the rest of the board before anyone in this room had finished laughing. Vaughn heard it too. Whatever resolve had been holding his thoracic shield upright went out of him all at once, the way air leaves something that was never built to hold pressure. He did not look like a high marshal anymore. He looked like a being standing very close to the edge of a number he could no longer pretend not to understand. Koss straightened at his console, civilian fear giving way for the first time to something that looked almost like resolve. "High Marshal, step away from the lane." His voice didn't shake this time. "That's not a request from her anymore, it's one from me." Vaughn's eye stalks swiveled toward him, slow, uncomprehending, like a creature trying to remember the shape of an order it had only ever given before. "You don't have the authority to." "I have whatever authority is left standing in this room," Koss said. "Look around, count who's still standing near you." Nobody was. The lane behind Vaughn had emptied entirely, guards and clerks and junior officers alike drawn back toward the walls in a loose, silent perimeter, all of them watching him the way a crowd watches whether they've already decided has nothing left to offer them. Vaughn looked down at the deck, where the badge had skidded earlier, the small dent in its edge catching the crimson light from the targeting display, and for the first time since the windows had torn open, he didn't say anything at all. The silence held the full weight of the fleet behind it, patient, unfired, and entirely unimpressed. 2 station security officers, neither of them Vaughn's, moved into the open lane on Koss's nod, boots quiet on the chrome, and took up positions a careful distance from the High Marshal's flanks. Not touching him, not yet, just close enough that everyone in the bay understood what the distance meant. Elizabeth's wristcom pulsed once against her skin, a different rhythm than before, the kind a commander learns to read without looking down. Somewhere above the station, a full deck of weapons officers were waiting on a word she hadn't given them yet, holding their locks steady on a grid they could collapse in less time than it took most people to finish a sentence. She didn't give the word. Not because Vaughn had earned mercy, because he hadn't finished earning the alternative, and she had never once, in 3 centuries of careful family discipline, given an order before it was the only order left. Elena leaned her head against her mother's hip, the dented badge still closed in her small fist, and watched the High Marshal the way children watch storms from the safe side of a window, with quiet, unblinking interest and no real understanding yet of how close the glass actually was. Vaughn's mandibles opened. Whatever he meant to say, the room would never find out, because that was the exact moment the bay's lights guttered, dimmed, and came back one shade darker than before. Something on the dreadnought formation had just changed its mind. The lights did not come back at full strength. They steadied at something just below normal, a shade that made the chrome walls look like old pewter, and in that dimness, every shadow in the processing bay fell harder and colder than it had before. Nobody moved to adjust them. Nobody on the station's grid would have known which switch to touch without asking a system that was no longer answering questions. Vaughn's mandibles were still open. That was the detail that stayed with Guard Wren later, when he filed his incident report in the smallest office on the station's lower administrative deck, his hands steadier than he expected them to be. The High Marshal's mouth had been open and nothing had come out of it, and somehow that silence had occupied more of the room than any order Vaughn had ever given. The dreadnought formation had changed its posture. That was the only word for it. 62 ships, each one large enough to swallow this station's transit ring and still have room for the argument, had shifted their angle by something the junior technicians' instruments measured as 4 degrees. 4 degrees was nothing on a navigation chart. In targeting geometry, 4 degrees was the difference between a held lock and a final solution. The technician didn't say this out loud. She looked at the number on her display, translated it the way her training had taught her to, and then set her hands in her lap and waited. "Sir," the word came from Koss, aimed at nobody in particular, the kind of word a person says when they need to hear their own voice confirm they are still present in the room. He said it again, quieter, aimed at himself this time, "Sir." He looked at Elizabeth. She was crouched beside Elena, one knee on the deck, adjusting the top button of her daughter's coat the way she had already done once and apparently saw reason to do again. Her hands moved without urgency. The badge was still in Elena's fist, the dented edge catching a thin line of the pewter light, and Elena's eyes were still on Vaughn with that particular expression children use when they are waiting for the obvious part of a thing to resolve itself. "I have a question," Elena said. Elizabeth straightened the button and then didn't straighten up. She stayed at eye level. "Ask it quietly." "Why is he leaking?" Koss made a sound in his throat that he converted, successfully, into a cough. The nearest guard did not convert anything. He turned his face toward the wall and was very still for a moment. The musk had spread further. It ran a dark line down the center of Vaughn's thoracic shield now, following the ridge of the old scar from some minor border skirmish that had never actually threatened him, and it dripped in slow intervals onto the chrome deck near his front left foot, where it made a small, steady sound that everyone in the room had been hearing for the past 40 seconds, and everyone had decided not to name. "He's frightened," Elizabeth said, the same tone she might have used to explain weather. "Did you make him frightened?" Elena asked. "He did that himself." She rose then, smoothing the front of her coat, and finally turned back to the High Marshal with the particular unhurried quality of someone returning to a chore they left unfinished. She looked at Vaughn the way she had looked at him throughout, without heat, without any of the satisfaction that would have made it personal. "You have had longer than 47 seconds, she said. "I want you to understand that the fleet has also noticed." Vaughn's central eye stalk swiveled involuntarily toward the observation glass. The dreadnoughts sat in their precise ring, guns still awake, patient as mathematics. The station's exterior running lights, the amber strips that normally outline the defense ring's outer edge, had stopped pulsing. They were simply off. The fleet had not done that either. The station's own power routing had done it, diverting every available draw toward systems that still functioned and away from ones that were now purely decorative. "This is not," Vaughn started. His mandibles found their position and lost it again. "You cannot impose a Line 1 siege formation inside a recognized Concordat hub without." "It's already imposed," Elizabeth said. "That sentence doesn't have an ending that helps you." The comm panel on the far wall lit up with an external line, not local frequency, not station to station, but the wideband system relay that crossed sector boundaries and didn't ask permission to do it. Koss moved toward it and then stopped halfway when the voice that came through was not the one he expected. It was not a voice from another station. It was not a voice from the approaching fleet. It was a voice from the Concordat's own administrative tier, 7 levels above Vaughn's rank on a good day, and it spoke in the measured, exhausted tone of an institution that had already been briefed and had already made its calculations and had decided to stop being surprised. Concordat Hub Prime, this is Central Administrative Command, Sector Adjudicator Pell. We are acknowledging an active engagement between colonial fleet elements and hub infrastructure. We are also acknowledging the initiating incident. A review board has been convened. Effective immediately, all executive security privileges held by the on-site Provost High Marshal are suspended pending adjudication. Local command authority transfers to Station Director COS. Compliance is expected within the next 3 minutes. The relay clicked off. 3 minutes, not a request. A timetable delivered the way Elizabeth had delivered hers, flat, specific, and already in motion before the sentence was finished. Vaughn turned, not toward the comm panel, not toward the glass. He turned toward his guards, the ones who had set their prods on the floor 10 minutes ago, the ones who had backed away from his command platform in ones and twos until there was nobody left within arm's reach of his position. None of them looked back at him. There will be no jurisdiction left to argue. There will be no immunity left to claim. He turned toward Transit Deputy Vane, who had put her clipboard down and walked away from her station, and was now standing near the far exit corridor with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the proceedings with the careful, uninvolved expression of a person who has already submitted their incident form in their head and is simply waiting for the meeting to end. He turned toward Clark Zix, who had not counted anything in a very long time and whose 4 nostrils were clamped almost shut in a full defensive reflex, his stamp pile still scattered across the floor where it had fallen, uncollected, the squares overlapping each other in the random arrangement of things that land where physics puts them rather than where anyone intended. He turned toward the observation glass, where 62 hulls waited with the patience of things that did not need to win an argument because they had already won the argument by arriving. And then Vaughn did something that nobody in the processing bay had seen coming, not because it was unpredictable in retrospect, but because the room had spent so long anticipating the shape of his resistance that its absence landed harder than the resistance would have. He sat down. Not collapsed, sat, the way a very large, very tired creature sits when it has finished carrying something heavy and has decided, at last, to put it down. His armored legs folded under him in the particular geometry of his species, and he settled onto the chrome deck with a sound like distant gravel, and he put his 2 front legs flat on the floor in front of him, and he said nothing. The musk kept dripping. He didn't seem to notice. Elena watched him for a moment. Then she leaned her head against her mother's hip and looked at the floor instead, apparently satisfied that the obvious part had now resolved itself. Cos stood very still for exactly 2 seconds, doing the math that his position now required him to do, and then he nodded once and touched the station-wide comm. This is Station Director Cos. All checkpoint personnel stand down from secondary alert. I'm authorizing transfer of custody of the on-site Provost High Marshal to incoming Colonial Extraction Team. Dock 7 is to be cleared and held open. He paused. That's all. He clicked off and turned to Elizabeth. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the badge in Elena's hand, at the dent along one edge, at the way Elena had her thumb over the dent the way her mother had straightened it every morning. He looked at Elizabeth's hand, where the smallest finger ended at the last knuckle, and he thought about 3 centuries, about what it costs to tame a volatile gravity well, about how little paperwork those centuries had ever asked for in return. Is there anything the station can provide, he said very carefully, for your daughter's transit? Elizabeth looked at him, not long, just enough to take the measure of the question and decide it was genuine. A direct lane, she said, unattended, and someone to straighten out Zix's stamp pile so the next family through doesn't spend an hour in secondary processing because his count was off. Cos nodded, done. He moved to the counter and began issuing the sequence of station-level overrides that the next 3 minutes of compliance required, his voice quiet and efficient over the internal channel, the voice of a man who has found something useful to do and is grateful for it. The extraction team came through Dock 7 11 minutes later, 4 Terran personnel in unmarked transit were, efficient and brief, who collected the former High Marshal without ceremony and without a word exchanged that wasn't logistical. Vaughn didn't speak during the transfer. He walked where he was directed to walk, and that was all. Elena watched them leave. "Is he going to come back?" she asked. "No," Elizabeth said. "Good," Elena said, and that was her complete editorial position on the matter, delivered with the certainty of someone who has gathered sufficient data. The klaxons had stopped. The station's environmental systems were rerouting power back toward comfort in careful increments, and the lighting returned by degrees, chrome brightening toward its ordinary silver, shadows pulling back to their normal proportions. On the tactical display, the crimson target locks were cycling down one by one as Elizabeth's wristcom sent the stand-down sequence to the fleet in the same quiet way it had sent the original transmission, without announcement, without ceremony, without anyone in the room being asked to witness it. The dreadnoughts did not leave immediately. They held their ring for another 12 minutes while the stand-down was confirmed and logged and countersigned at a level of the Concordat's administrative chain that Vaughn would never again have access to. Then, one by one, in the same precise order they had arrived, they folded back into the subspace lanes and were gone. The gas giant's orange light came back across the observation glass in a slow, widening band, filling the bay the way morning fills a room when someone opens a curtain, unhurried and complete. Clark Zix had collected his stamp pile. He was counting very quietly, starting over twice, and he didn't look up when Elizabeth guided Elena past his counter toward the direct lane Kos had cleared, but one of his 4 nostrils angled briefly in their direction as they passed, which was, for Clark Zix, the closest available equivalent to a nod. The direct lane was empty and clean and exactly what it said it was. No secondary processing flags, no administrative holds, no one standing in the transit path with a mandate and a gold sash, and a great deal of certainty about how the morning was going to go. At the end of the lane, the docking corridor opened toward their shuttle, and Elena shifted the badge from her right hand to her left so she could hold her mother's hand properly, the way she always did when a threshold was coming. The brass caught the light one more time as she moved it, dented and warm and unchanged in the ways that mattered. She pinned it back over her coat pocket at the threshold, slightly crooked, and didn't ask anyone to straighten it.